think we should start, and because we will have more time than if we don't wait. Well, is that okay?
Yeah.
So, welcome to tonight's public program, part of Summer School 2021. I'm very happy that tonight we have two presentations which are focused on urban gardens, urban community gardens, artistic interventions in public spaces, urban spaces. Presentation by Jeff Hu and Oshka Yurman. I'll just read briefly something from, let's say, a selection from Jeffrey Hu's biography. First, to thank you for being with us tonight. I hope next year we will have you with us in Pristina. This time around, it was valuable for us to have your intervention through video link. Jeff is a PhD. Jeff has, let's say, a PhD, but it's also a professor of landscape architecture and director of Urban Commons Lab at the University of Washington in Seattle. His work focuses on public space, democracy, community design, and civic engagement. In a career that spans the Pacific, Hu has worked with indigenous tribes, farmers, and fishers in Taiwan, neighborhood residents in Japan, villagers in China, and inner city immigrant youth and elders in North American cities on projects ranging from conservation of wildlife habitats to design of urban open space. He has written extensively on the agency of citizens and communities in shaping the built environments, with collaborative publications including Insurgent Public Space, Guerrilla Urbanism and Remaking of Contemporary Cities, and the Design as Democracy, Techniques for Collective Creativity, 2017. He's the co-founder of the Pacific Rim Community Design Network and a City of Vienna visiting professor at the TU Vienna in 2013-2014. Tonight's presentation is titled Urban Community Gardens as Multimodal Social Spaces. The abstract starts with urban gardening, how it has become a worldwide movement in recent years. This is a movement that we would like to spread also, let's say, in Kosovo. Through a review of cases in Seattle, USA, and elsewhere in the world, Jeff's talk examines urban community gardens in terms of their multiple benefits and modalities, specifically as a convivial space, a cultural space, an inclusive space, a restorative space, a democratic space, and a resilient space. I have to mention also that for tonight's talk, we invited Lilina Liu, who also leads course 8, Barton Summer School 2018, to discuss with Jeff after the presentation. I have to thank her as well for doing the course this year and for being with us tonight. I will not make it longer. Jeff, the floor is yours. Thank you again.
Hey, thank you. Thank you for the wonderful invitation to join this event. And of course, I wish I could be there in person. So one of these days. So I was asked to speak about community gardens today. So that's what I will do. Okay. Let's see if I can move this forward. All right, so in recent years, with the rising concern for food-related issues as listed here, along with climate change and growing environmental concern, urban agriculture and edible landscape have become a global trend, as evident in an increasing number of initiatives and projects around the world. In cities across there has been a resurgent interest and demand for community gardens. This is Vancouver, British Columbia. In 2006, to meet the growing demand, Vancouver City Council passed a motion to complete 2010 new gardens by the year 2010 as a legacy of the 2010 Winter Olympic Games. And the community garden and agriculture movement has been growing in Asia as well. in 2012, Seoul Barton government set a goal to become a world capital of urban architecture by 2018. And having 2020 garden sites by the year 2020. Even in places such as Hong Kong, where you have the challenge of land scarcity, urban gardening is growing on rooftops, including those on top of industrial.
Jeff, can
Jeff,
can I interrupt you for a second? Jeff, can I interrupt you for a second? We cannot hear you very well. Something with your mic. Could you just stand a bit closer, or I'm not sure.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Okay.
I'm hearing echoes as well, so
yes. Yes, there's an echo, and then we lose you from time to time. Thank you.
Okay. I'll try my. Okay, so this is the Metro Plaza rooftop farm that is part of a large shopping mall. There are also examples in Tokyo. This one on a former middle school building, now converted into an art center. And in Singapore, this is a rooftop aquaponic system. So it's not your typical community garden, but it still involves the network of volunteers, much like a community garden. Even in Northern Europe, where urban gardening has had a longer tradition, new gardens are popping up sometimes in active places, including abandoned railroad track here in Stockholm, and in Vienna along the Donau Canal, together with beach bars, cafes, and community art. Urban gardens, in a way, is becoming part of a new urban aesthetic. So I started my research in community gardening around 2005, 16 years ago, as part of a team that received a grant from the Landscape Architecture Foundation. This project was to understand community garden as a particular form of urban space. And this is the book that was published later in 2000. Focusing on Seattle, we looked at a collection of gardens that ranged from formerly vacant sites underneath power lines that were converted into an actively used community garden. And also a lot of community gardens in Seattle and elsewhere have turned underutilized spaces like this into productive and vibrant community spaces. This is another example, the Interbay P-Patch. In Seattle, we call our community garden P-Patch. This one actually sits on top of a municipal landfill. It is now used as a golf course. There are also gardens located next to the freeway, but now also actively used by the community, such as the Danny Wu garden. In this particular case, it's a great amenity to the elderly immigrant residents in the neighborhood of International District. There are also more formalized garden sites. In this case, it's part of the redevelopment of a former military base into a large urban park. This is a close-up view of the gardens, one of the largest community gardens in the city of Seattle. So together, there are about 90 sites throughout the city today. The neighborhood with both affluent residents as well as low-income households. Community gardens are often associated with food production, but one example after another, Seattle and elsewhere, we see community gardens focusing, functioning also as an important social space. So for the rest of my talk today, I'd like to focus on a few dimensions of social spaces in community gardens in Seattle that have come across over the years. The talk is actually based on a book chapter that I wrote and was published in the volume or Britain cities form and function. I'm happy to share a copy of the chapter later on after the session. Anyone who's interested. So starting with community garden as a convivial space. Community gardens are more than just growing food. In Seattle, gardens are used for a variety of events, from holiday celebrations to garden parties and picnics. These activities often serve as a way to bring people together, to socialize, and to build community through convivial activities. So you see a list of activities in different sites that we have come across. The Interbay P-Patch, for example, is best known for its salmon barbecue, which can sometimes function as a fundraising tool to help raise money for the garden. And at Bradner Gardens Park, there are yoga lessons as well as New Year celebration, among many other activities that take place in the garden that bring additional users to the site. So not just gardeners. So community garden function as a social space for the larger community. At Marra Farm, which is another site in Seattle, social events with food also help bring gardeners, neighbors, and volunteers together. They provide an opportunity for these different stakeholder groups to have a chance to meet each other, to socialize, and also to have fun. At Danny Wu Garden, located in the International District, gardeners and neighbors, they come together for the annual pig roast, and events that celebrates the history of activism in the community. And as such, the garden itself becomes sort of a symbol of community activism and self-help that started in the early 1970s. The events reinforce the sense of the shared struggle. So it's also a community garden function as a vehicle for community building. And there are also other events such as this community concerts and other musical performances. In Seattle, conviviality is associated not only with leisure events, but also with work. At the Interbay P-Patch, for example, gardeners and volunteers work together on things such as building a new tool shed and community kitchen, and celebrate their effort afterwards. So they call this a work party. So combining work with leisure. So it's a form of conviviality as well. So there's a reason why these places are called community gardens. So garden in this case function as a vehicle for conviviality and also community building. Community gardens also function as a cultural space. In Seattle, community gardens they function as sites where specific cultural groups, including immigrants and ethnic minorities, can continue their cultural practices through growing food. At Marra Farm, for example, you're looking at the Mien garden. So the garden run by a Mien community from Southeast Asia that has a very distinct look because it follows the traditional methods of cultivation. Unlike most other gardens in Seattle. It's through these gardens that knowledge and culture from one generation is passed down to the next. This is another example of this P-Patch, also a community garden in Seattle with a very distinct cultural ambience. Also similar to Marra Farm, the garden here provides opportunity for new immigrants to continue the cultural tradition of food production, diets, cooking, and socializing. So you're looking at a quote from a gardener. So my families are farmers. So we have been farming for a long time, for a few generations already. So I guess it's in the blood. So garden allow that lineage, that tradition to pass from one generation to the next. Even on a foreign land. So combined with conviviality and socializing, gardens can also be places for intercultural learning and understanding. What better ways to learn about a culture than through food? And because of these opportunities and interactions, community gardens can serve also as inclusive spaces as well. In a chapter written for the book Transcultural Cities that I edited and published in 2013, Adam Prince presents a case in Oakland, California, in which community gardens function as a place for everyday interaction between gardeners of different cultural backgrounds. So gardening provides a topic of common conversation, as well as opportunities to work together despite language barriers, despite other forms of kind of cultural barrier. Provide a vehicle to talk to each other and to learn from each other. And as such, the garden becomes an inclusive space. The garden provides opportunity for folks of different cultural background to develop and deepen their social ties through gardening, through eating and having conversations together. This notion of inclusiveness also extends to other forms of diversity, age diversity, for example. Different age group can also come and enjoy the garden together. In Seattle, children's gardens are very popular. They allow children to learn about gardening and also for parents to bring their children to the garden so that they don't have to leave them at home or not having the opportunity to bring their kids along. So they allow the garden to become an intergenerational space. Many gardens in Seattle also set aside plots in the garden to grow food for food bank to help those in need. So in these cases, the notion of inclusiveness or inclusivity extends well beyond the boundary of the garden itself. Next, community gardens are also an important restorative space. In one conversation after another, the gardeners that we have interviewed often talk about how happy they were to see plants grow. There's a sense of kind of fulfillment and accomplishment that come along with working in the garden. So gardening is both therapeutic and restorative. Especially for the older adults, they also provides opportunity for physical activities that are important for their health. Socializing in the garden can also be restorative. Many years ago, we asked gardeners in their new garden to take picture of things that they like in the garden. And these are the pictures that they took and brought back. Most people took pictures of vegetations, obviously, but one older gentleman took picture of all his friends in the garden. So for him, the most important thing in the garden are the people. So there's a quote here: "The garden is a great place to meet friends and have conversations. Elderly people need people to talk with." And so this gentleman on the right here, Mr. Su, was the one that took the pictures. As a newcomer to the neighborhood, the garden allowed him to make friends and find a sense of belonging in the neighborhood. Next, in Seattle, community gardens also function as a democratic space, an exercise in grassroots everyday democracy. Barton Street P-Patch is one example. Like many community gardens in Seattle, the garden was designed and developed with input from gardeners and volunteers. The gardeners first chose from a menu of options provided by a design team that they hired with funding from the city. In this case, they chose the version that with a large burst tree as the central meeting space in the garden. But everything after that, after the design was chosen, was built, the rest of the garden was built by the gardeners and volunteers using material that each of them brought to the site, including what looked like leftover construction material that might be from somebody's backyard. And then after, what was interesting is that after the initial construction, the involvement, engagement continued with gardeners and neighbors kept adding things to the garden. So first, the ceramic object that would somehow sit on top of these construction materials. And then custom built artwork started to appear. So one day I ran into the garden, the artist who was putting the final touch on the new artwork. And so what was interesting about, and this is one of my favorite gardens in Seattle. And so one of the most interesting thing about these types of gardens that it's never the same every time you go. There's always something new. And because of that, it's organic, it's constantly evolving with the involvement of people, gardeners and volunteers alike. So in this particular case, the community documented the entire construction process from beginning to finish. So this is an example of community garden as a democratic space, a space that was created through collaboration, participation, and deliberation. In Seattle, because not every community or neighborhood has the capacity or resources to develop a project like this, the one we saw at the Barton Street P-Patch. But the city has a funding program to support this kind of project that are initiated by the community. It's called the Neighborhood Matching Fund Program. The program was founded in the late 1980s and continued to support community initiatives in different categories of funding. So originally, small and simple grants, large project grant, and small sparse grants, a different amount of money to support different kinds of projects. And what was interesting was the community could also include volunteers hours in exchange for cash match from the city. So the community doesn't have to have the money to match. They can match with labor. Bradner Gardens Park was one example that was created through the Neighborhood Matching Funds program. So this is what the garden and the park look like today. The Matching Funds program specifically funded the community to hire a designer to work with them to come up with a master plan. And like the Barton Street P-Patch, it was the community that built the garden in the park with help of volunteers, and also from students from my university. And volunteers includes artists in the community who made almost every features in the garden a piece of artwork, including the public restroom, which was ranked by a local newspaper in Seattle as one of the top 10 public restrooms in the city. I'm not sure if any other city in the world had such kind of ranking. Anyway, one more project. This is the West Seattle Bee Garden. The garden was proposed by a high school student, who's actually the lady in yellow on the right here in the picture. So she applied for a neighborhood matching fund when she was still in high school and got the grant to build the garden. She wanted the garden to highlight the decline of bee population around the world, and so she used the fund to hire an architect to design an apiary that is both functional and educational, so that the neighbors and especially kids in the neighborhood can learn about bees and actually participate in beekeeping. So this is so they do raise bees here on the site. And like most gardens, the site also functions as a social space for neighbors and gardeners. So coming full circle to the notion of conviviality. So these different dimensions are not separated from each other. Rather, They are part of a sort of a dynamic system. Last but not least, community gardens as a resilient space. So in the face of greater frequency of climate disasters and disturbances, community gardens can play a role as well. In the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy that hit the eastern seaboard of the United States in 2012, one of the areas most was hit the hardest in New York City was the Far Rockaway neighborhood in Queens, the dot that you see here on the map, which faces the ocean. Thousands of residents lost power and access to food and supplies after the hurricane, while outside relief was not able to reach the neighborhood except for volunteers on bikes. So during that time, a community garden became a place where neighbors could get help from each other, share meals, and find comfort during the disaster. It was particularly remarkable because the garden was still relatively new at the time, and has only experienced 2 growing seasons. But already there were social connections among the gardeners and neighbors that enabled them to work together. So the garden, in this particular case, played an important role in times of calamity. In Seattle, our city government came up with a plan in 2017 to designate all community garden sites in the city as community emergency hub. So in the effort to expand the network of community emergency hub around the city. And the plan makes perfect sense because first, community gardens are already fairly evenly distributed throughout the city. So almost every neighborhood has a community garden, sometimes 2 or more. Secondly, most community gardens are quite accessible. There's also food already in the community gardens that can be useful in times of emergency. Third, community gardens are already places that have infrastructure for washing, preparing, and cooking food. Many of them have outdoor ovens, for example. So obviously during emergency events, this can be quite useful. At the Beacon Food Forest that you're looking at here, so one of the garden sites in Seattle, there's even rainwater harvesting built into the design. So here the rainwater is collected in an underground cistern. So there's water available for emergency use as well. And then lastly, community gardens are places where neighbors, gardeners, volunteers, and visitors could go on a regular basis. There are social networks in place that could be mobilized in times of emergency. And these social connections are an important part of the social resilience in the community. So again, coming full circle back to the important role of community garden as a social space. In times of emergency, as well as on an everyday basis, citizens need support from each other. The resurgence of mutual aid initiative during the COVID-19 pandemic is a reminder of the importance of social connection and how urban space, such as community garden, can help to facilitate those sort of social connections in cities around the world. So to conclude, the multiple dimensions of community gardens as a social space is perhaps something that we need to consider for other types of urban spaces as well. So not just community gardens. What if we can create more conviviality in the full range of spaces throughout the city? What if we can support more cultural and intercultural practices in urban spaces? What if we can make our urban environments more inclusive? What if we can allow people to find respite in the everyday environments? what if we can make urban spaces a vehicle for active democracy? And lastly, what if we can consider all these processes, conviviality, inclusiveness, democracy, and so forth, is contributing to the resilience of our city and society. So I hope that leave you with something to think about. And thank you again for the opportunity to speak today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Good questions to start from, I think. I will give the floor to Verena initially, and then we can take more questions maybe.
Sure.
Thank you, Andres. Thank you very much, Jeff. It was really nice to see all these pictures. Usually pictures talk. I mean, of course that we were listening to you, and it was like music behind the very nice truth there. But it's quite enlightening when you see these actions put in place and documented through pictures. We really would love to see such initiatives around here too. So I hope Albert will not just keep this subject in the, how shall I say, the theoretical level, but would initiate something because they've got great infrastructure that really can really help, how shall I say, put the word around and see what we can do in this respect. So to start the conversation maybe and open the debate, I mean, definitely there are those 6 types of engagements, or let's say commitments or spaces or effects that we can achieve through this community activism and engagement towards going back to the nature, which is garden in this case. Convivial, cultural, inclusive, restorative, democratic resilience. I would maybe focus in one of those, let's say, one of those components. I would concentrate in the democratic component of the project, of the whole thing. I mean, yes, if we say that the democracy is reached through the activities from the moment we establish, let's say, pinpoint the land and then establish the management and policy and design and get people together. Definitely we are here talking about democracy, but is there any, let's say, a more politically oriented democracy that can be triggered through these projects? Say, how do you animate the political will? You might have an idea that here in Balkans or in Kosovo, I mean, we really engage, and we have to go to push a lot in order to get, you know, a small sparkle of a certain little political will in order to come to such proposals. So basically, through papers, through plans, urban plans, through specific projects, what was the initial, or how did it become bureaucratized in Seattle, this concept or the idea of project of urban gardening? This would be like the first one. And then not to forget, I will say also something else. Perhaps we have a kind of memory embodied from the communist time. We used to have the so-called agricultural cooperatives, cooperativa. Do you know what that is? If yes, it was present in Eastern Bloc, in communist-led countries. Is there a resemblance of projects of urban, of this kind of community? Now we are working with different type of wording. It's community, but then there was this word cooperativa, which would cover both community and engagement and voluntarism and management by the state, in this case, not by, let's say, an NGO or an entity, which is different and not. So if there is a resemblance in the process then what is the democratic principle that combines those two in effect? To start with.
Okay. All right, I can start. Those are very good comments, and thank you for that. And it's great to see, to hear about some of the parallel between examples here in Seattle and also in Kosovo. In terms of principle, I think perhaps the most important principle of democracy in the context of community gardens is active engagement. So people working together on something and having to make collective decisions on things that matters to them. And so it's more of a form of kind of everyday democracy. It's not democracy in terms of like running for election, running for offices, and at that level. It's more about people working together, having to kind of negotiate with each other and to make the garden work. And then oftentimes, because in the community, a lot of issues are intertwined, right? So the garden is not entirely separated from other, so it's part of the public realm, it's the public sphere. And so the garden provides an opportunity for a person to step out of his or her personal space into the public sphere, right? And because it's part of the everyday practice, is sort of it lowered the threshold for political participation. So unlike other forms of political participation that may require some form of capacity, gardening is sort of a low-hanging fruit, if you will, or something that's having a lower threshold that enable people to come and participate. But it doesn't always stop there. Right? It often develop into something else. And so, for example, the Bradner Gardens Park project that I mentioned, and you see that with there's a lot of artwork, that particular project. And the garden site at one point was going to be sold by the city to a private developer. And but the community was not happy about it because they've been working on this garden for a very long time. And but because they have been working together for quite some time, they decided collectively that they don't want the city to sell their land. So they initiated a campaign and working with other advocacy groups in the city, and petitioned the city council to pass a resolution that would require the city to compensate a community with equal amount of park land if a park's property was going to be sold. So it's an example where you see the collective capacity at the garden become elevated to a more active political engagement that has a real impact on the policy. So, for example, when so after the law was passed, at one point, the CEO of Starbucks wanted to purchase a park property for his driveway. He could not do that in Seattle. And so this is an example where you can begin to see the connection between the everyday democracy and the active political engagement at a much higher level.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's do we have any more? Okay. Let's open the floor if there's any other interventions at this time. I have a few questions. So I have a few questions, Jeff, if I may. Were you directly involved in any of the projects that you showed?
Sort of directly and indirectly. Mostly, my students are actually more involved than me. So, for example, Daniel Garden, the one I mentioned before with the pig roast and all the events, the neighborhood concerts. One of my students was involved with a master plan to sort of upgrade the garden. And then another student was involved with building a chicken coop in the garden. And then one other student was involved with building a community kitchen. And so I often don't have enough time myself to become more engaged with these projects. So I involve my students. They become more engaged directly. I was going to show one project that two of my students designed is on top of a multi-story parking garage. And so I'm involved in Daniel Garden, for example, I'm involved with the Friends group. So the Friends group helped sort of fundraise and sort of provide support for the garden. So that's to the extent I was able to become involved in those projects.
Why I'm asking is just to see, in effect, the influence of academic positions or the infrastructure that the universities provide for thinking and experimentation, but also for influencing directly even policy making or let's say developments on the social sphere. Because the tendency here, or maybe this is an observation purely, is that the academic life is pretty isolated from the reality. And rarely we have cases when, let's say, initiatives are taken to throw that knowledge out in the public sphere and in the public realm, basically. So that was my first question. The second one was, so now you're with us connecting from Taiwan, and that's another context, basically, because there are reasons why, and maybe in connection with what Verena asked, cooperatives were explored very much, not only in former socialist countries, but there are examples of cooperatives functioning internationally, but they are a left mindset in a way of co-organizing communities, let's say, co-organizing communities. But even in Kosovo, my perception was that actually the state did not necessarily control everything. So there was a shared responsibility among those who were connected in a cooperative. There was a sense of self-management in the cooperatives as well, which was quite, at some points, quite highly democratized, to call it. But this is for another question and research. I wanted to see with you whether there are similar, let's say, developments, initiatives, interventions organized in Taiwan. Because that's another context, right? But it's closely related, and for me that would be an interesting information to share with us.
Sure. Yeah. So in Taipei, for example, I was actually involved with formulating the policy for the city. I was part of a advocacy group that became active during the mayoral election in 2014. So we asked all the mayoral candidates if they would support community gardening. And because food safety was a very important issue at the time, and people wanted to grow food on their own. So there was a sort of political window of opportunity that we became quite successful. So the one of the candidates that supported our policy paper, so he was elected and then made it a policy. So since 2015, we now have over 700 community gardens in Taipei. that was supported by the policy. But to get back to what you mentioned before about cooperation, this would not be possible without the several nonprofit groups in the city. So we have a system called community university. It's not a real university, it's more of a sort of adult education nonprofit system. And so they offer many classes at the neighborhood level, and including gardening classes. And so they were commissioned by the city to introduce more classes so that people can learn more about gardening. And that was quite critical because you cannot just expect people to know how to garden. They need to be trained. And also there are a group that provide technical support if people run into issues. They are volunteer groups that provide help for a community that may not have the kind of human resources to put together a garden. So it's very much kind of city providing the resources necessary, but the civil society also play a very important role in providing the knowledge and the networks. And it's through that collaboration that the city was able to increase the number of community gardens from just a handful to almost 700.
Thank you so much. I mean, we have upcoming elections, municipal elections in Kosovo, September or October, I think. Yeah. So maybe yes, we will make a step in that direction. But if there's no questions in the hall, I would like to thank you once again for joining us and for sharing with us your work. And I'm very happy that we could include you in the program this year, and hopefully we will have you in Kosovo very soon.
Yeah, I'll be happy to. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Karina, as well. Thank you.
Okay.
So we will continue the program with the presentation by Ushka Yurman. She will present a case of garden intervention in Ljubljana, in Slovenia. We can take a 5-minute break if you want, and we will continue after that. Thank you.
Thanks.